In this video, I want to look at some examples of enantiomers and kind of see how similar these structures can be, and then how different some of the effects of being an enantiomer can be. I suspect this should be a short movie just to look at a couple of examples. So hopefully it's interesting. Okay, so let's look at an example of a few pairs of enantiomers. Remember that a chiral molecule can only have one enantiomer. So examples of a few enantiomer pairs are this molecule, and then I'm going to draw the enantiomer as the mirror image. So when we draw the mirror image, the wedge stays as the wedge, but if we keep the orientation the same, we could actually flip the wedge to a dash, and that would also give rise to the enantiomer. So we have the enantiomeric depiction by mirror image, by showing the mirror image. Okay, so what's interesting about these is that they highlight the fact that our olfactory receptors, which are in our nose, allow for the sense of smell, are chiral. And as a result, each of these enantiomers will interact with the olfactory receptors in our nose differently. And so what we smell in one side, which is caraway odor for one enantiomer, would actually provide the spearmint odor with a different enantiomer. So these two objects, these two molecules, are enantiomers. They have the exact same melting point, boiling point. Many properties are the same, but the interaction with other chiral objects is going to be different, where one, in the case of olfactory receptors, is going to send us a signal to our brain that's going to remind us of the smell caraway, whereas the other one's going to send a smell to our brain, which is spearmint. So why are olfactory receptors chiral? Again, I just want to remind us that biomolecules are chiral for the most part. I'm going to write out biological in this case. So biological molecules are chiral. That is, our proteins, DNA, RNA, carbohydrates, and many lipids, not all lipids. You'll see a few. I think like all carbohydrates are going to be chiral, and proteins and that sort of thing. There are a few amino acids that aren't, but you're not going to see too much achirality, lack of chirality within these three sets of molecules. And even with the last set of biomolecules, the lipids, you're still going to see a lot of them being chiral. Okay, so that's one example. But another example isn't as kind of fun of a story. That is the thalidomide sort of catastrophe. Always a little bit of a heartbreaker to show this example, but it highlights how important this is, particularly in medicine, not just like flavors and fragrances. So the thalidomide catastrophe. So what I'm going to draw is a sort of complicated molecule that does have a stereocenter in it, so it is a chiral molecule. Now that nitrogen, this wedge is a little bit awkward. I'm gonna flip it around because it goes from the nitrogen. It's still accurate, but this highlights the fact that our stereocenter is at this position on thalidomide. So we have a few nitrogens, as one does. I'm going to draw the enantiomer in this case with the same orientation. Since it's a more complicated molecule, flipping the entire thing around to draw the mirror image would be a little bit more difficult. So instead, I'm going to draw it with the same orientation, but I'm going to flip the wedge and the dash around, which I'm allowed to do. Just an alternative way of drawing the mirror image stereoisomer, which is the enantiomer. So these two things are mirror images. They're just not rotated properly to show, to have everything aligned to be mirror images, but rather they're they're kind of aligned in a way where you'd try to superimpose them, but you would see that the wedge and the dash would not correctly overlap, so they're not superimposable on each other. And they're different, they're mirror images, so they must be stereoisomers that are mirror images, so they must be enantiomers. Okay, so these two, again, are the enantiomers of thalidomide. And so this one on the left is fairly useful. It alleviates morning sickness. So morning sickness, those symptoms that pregnant individuals often feel, especially in the first trimester of pregnancy, where kind of nauseous, just uncomfortable, extensive gag reflex, that sort of thing. It's a fairly miserable situation to add on to the fact that you're growing a human in your abdomen. So if you could not have morning sickness during pregnancy, life would be better. And in fact, it was made better by this molecule thalidomide. So when people took this, they didn't feel the effects of thalidomide so much. However, enantiomers interact with chiral objects differently. Many of the molecules in the body are chiral, including those molecules that are used to develop other individuals during pregnancy. And so the problem was that this alternative enantiomer led to severe birth defects. And so this would really hamper the development of the growing child inside of the pregnant individual, causing severe birth defects. For the most part, it would result in death before the child was born. So a lot of children were lost because people were actually consuming both of these enantiomers in their pill. So it turns out that a mixture of both was sold over the counter. Disappointing, right? Well, we didn't know that much at the time about the bad actor here. We didn't know as much about the severe birth defects. Plus, this was before a time when the FDA was so strictly regulating drugs. These were sold over the counter, especially right after World War II. And so many children were lost, but 10,000 or so, approximately 10,000 children were born with badly deformed limbs. So of the children that did survive, they were born with these badly deformed limbs, and physicians called these limbs, we would call them kind of flipper or fin-like limbs, because they just sort of stopped growing at a certain point. So obviously disappointing in such a catastrophe, because again, so many lives were lost. And it's just hard because we didn't know. And if you're the patient that's taking these pills, you just trust your physicians. You trust that your physicians understand the chemistry. Now, the whole scientific community was not aware of this. So it's not like physicians were ignoring the advice of the scientists. But people did the best they could. Turns out that it's much easier to actually produce produce a mixture of both enantiomers, because they have such similar properties. It's hard to separate or purify the two enantiomers from each other. So it's just hard to get them apart. Now, we did go to the trouble as scientists to make the good enantiomer, the one that's shown here with a wedge. We went to the trouble of making that and getting it into a pill. Here's the issue. Under slightly basic conditions, around pH 8, the pH of blood, this will undergo a reaction where it actually converts back into a one-to-one mixture of both enantiomers. And as a result, people that were putting into their mouth a single enantiomer, their body was metabolizing into the bad playing enantiomer, and the same effects still resulted. So really sad story, but it allows us to talk about the issues related to biology and chirality, and why understanding things like stereochemistry is so important, especially if we want to think about how molecules interact inside biological systems. It also allows us to talk about this idea of the racemic mixture. So a racemic mixture is a one-to-one, that is equal ratio mixture of 2 enantiomers okay? So this is an important term as we're trying to understand some issues in chirality and stereochemistry, and what we would say then is thalidomide was sold as a racemic mixture at the start, at least. So thalidomide was sold as a racemic mixture, and racemic mixture is just a one-to-one mixture of 2 enantiomers. Let's just do a quick thought experiment. We've been thinking about optical rotation. What is the optical rotation of a racemic mixture of a chiral molecule? So we've got 50% one enantiomer, 50% the other enantiomer. The 2 enantiomers rotate plane polarized light, that is the optical rotation, in equal but opposite directions. And so if we have equal amounts of these 2 rotators, the optical rotation will be really, no matter how much stuff you add, you don't have to normalize it. 0 is 0. So 50% of them rotate the light this way, 50% rotate light this way, and the additive effect is 0. We observe no rotation for a racemic mixture. It's only a pure mixture of enantiomer that we observe the actual specific rotation. And that's something to keep in mind as we look into, as we think about using optical rotation to be a characteristic property of chiral molecules. So quick short video looking at some, I guess, practical examples. It's always a little disheartening every time to share the story about thalidomide because it's such, a mischance. Because if you think about it, alleviating morning sickness is definitely, it can't be worth the cost of what happened.